Story 1. This story is about something that happened to me not too long ago. I had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy, but it had character. The kind of place that had creaky floors and a lingering smell of age. But I loved it. It was cheap, too, and I needed a fresh start after a rough year. Everything was fine at first. I spent my days unpacking, getting comfortable, and fixing up little things around the house. But one evening, something happened that I can't explain. It was a Friday, and I'd just come home from work. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the air felt thicker than usual. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed something strange. A door at the end of the hall that I hadn't seen before. Now, I knew the layout of the house pretty well, and I was certain that there had never been a door in that spot. There was nothing in the hall leading to it, just an empty wall that suddenly gave way to a door. At first, I thought I might be imagining things. I'd been working a lot, maybe I was just tired. But when I approached the door, I realized something even more unsettling. It was completely sealed off. The edges of the door were covered in thick layers of old, dry wood, as though it had been closed off for decades. There wasn't a doorknob, no keyhole, just a smooth, hard surface that looked almost unnatural. I knocked on the door out of curiosity. It didn't sound like a regular wall. There was a hollow echo to it, like something was on the other side, something hidden. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just a weird quirk of the house, an old renovation or something. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't let it go. I had to know what was behind it. The next day, I decided to get a crowbar from the shed. I figured I'd pry open the door and see what was on the other side. Maybe it was an old closet, or just a space that hadn't been used in years. When I finally managed to break through the seal, the smell hit me first. A thick, musty stench, like something had been rotting behind that door for a long time. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to push through it. The room on the other side was small, dimly lit by a single broken window. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floor was covered with old, brittle paper, some of it torn and yellowed with age. But what really caught my attention was what was in the center of the room, a large wooden chest. The chest was old, the wood dark and worn, its edges chipped and weathered. But it wasn't the chest that scared me. It was the feeling I got when I looked at it. It was like it was waiting for me, like something was calling me to open it. Against every instinct telling me to turn around and leave, I walked over to the chest. My hands shook as I grabbed the lid and pulled. It creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something. It was like the air had shifted, like there was something in the dark, something alive. My heart started pounding in my chest. My hands were slick with sweat, and then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but it was coming from the chest. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was unmistakable. It was screaming. The more I stared into the chest, the louder the whispers became, until it felt like they were vibrating in my skull. Suddenly, the room grew cold. I could see my breath in the air, and the shadows around me began to stretch, as though something was moving in the darkness, something unseen. I slammed the lid of the chest shut, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The whispers stopped immediately, but the sense of dread lingered, thick in the air. I stumbled back toward the door, closing it quickly and sealing it behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, scratching, like something was trying to get through the walls. I thought I was just being paranoid, but the sounds didn't stop. For the next few days, things only got worse. I'd find doors in my house that I was sure had been closed open. Lights flickered on their own. And the whispers. I could hear them, faint but growing louder. One night, I finally worked up the courage to go back to that room. I had to know if the chest was still there, if I had imagined the whole thing. But when I opened the door, I found something that made my blood run cold. The chest was gone. There was only the emptiness of the room, the dust, the papers, and a single note, scrawled in what looked like red ink. It read, "You shouldn't have opened the door. I've never been able to shake the feeling that something is still in this house with me. The whispers are gone, but I still hear things sometimes. The air gets thick, and I feel watched, and every now and then, if I stand still enough, I can hear the faint sound of scratching behind the walls dot whatever was behind that sealed door. I think it's still here waiting." Story 2. This story is about something that happened to me a few years ago when I first moved into my new home. The house was old, built in the 1920s, and had a history. At least, that's what the neighbors said. They warned me about the house being quirky, but I didn't think much of it. After all, I'd been looking for a place for months, and this one was a steal. The first few weeks were quiet. Everything seemed normal. I unpacked, cleaned, and settled into the large house, enjoying its character. It had tall ceilings, creaky floors, and ornate woodwork. But there was one thing that kept bugging me. A section of the wall in the living room that didn't seem right. I'd noticed it on the first day, but I brushed it off as nothing more than a quirk of old homes. The wallpaper seemed uneven, like it had been patched up or replaced hastily. But as I looked closer, I realized there was something strange about it. The edges were too perfect, as if the wall had been deliberately covered up. One night, after a few drinks, I got the idea to tear the wallpaper off and see what was behind it. I figured it was just an old, patched-up wall, maybe some exposed brick or wood. I wasn't prepared for what I found. As I pulled the paper away, a heavy wooden door came into view. It was hidden behind the wallpaper, sealed shut, and had clearly been there for a long time. The door was old, its wood warped with age, and the metal handle rusted beyond recognition. There was no doorknob, just a strange indentation in the center where one should have been. My heart began to race as I stood there, staring at the door. It didn't make sense. There were no doors in that part of the house, and yet here it was, right behind the wallpaper. I thought about leaving it alone, but curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't resist. I grabbed a crowbar and pried the door open, the metal creaking in protest. The room behind it was pitch black, but I could feel a cold draft coming from inside. I found the light switch by the door and flicked it on. The room was small, cramped, and completely empty, except for one thing, a large antique mirror standing against the far wall. The mirror was covered in dust, its surface cracked and warped. I couldn't understand why such a thing would be hidden away in a small, unused room behind a sealed door. I moved closer, drawn to the mirror, my reflection blurry in the dust-covered glass. As I wiped the dust away, the air around me grew colder, and the room felt oddly oppressive, but it was the reflection that made my stomach drop. It wasn't me. For a split second, I saw someone standing behind me in the mirror, tall, with long dark hair and a twisted, unnatural grin. My heart leaped in my chest and I spun around, but the room was empty, the reflection was gone. I backed away slowly, my head spinning. My mind raised questions. Was it just a trick of the light, a hallucination? I didn't want to stay in that room any longer. But something kept me from leaving. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, and I froze. For what felt like hours, I stood there, feeling as though something was watching me. The mirror seemed to pulse with some dark energy, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the house itself was holding me captive in that room. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and cold, coming from the mirror. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized, but the words were clear. You shouldn't have opened it. The room seemed to grow darker, the mirror reflecting nothing but blackness now. Panic surged through me, and I desperately shoved the door with all my strength. It finally gave way, and I tumbled out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I left the house that night, never looking back. I couldn't explain what happened, and I still can't. I never went back to the room, and I never touched that door again. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that reflection in the mirror. And sometimes, I hear that whisper, just faintly, telling me the same thing. You shouldn't have opened it. Story 3. This story is about something that happened to me years ago when I moved into an old house I bought on a whim. It was one of those places that looked perfect for a fixer-upper, lots of space, high ceilings, and a classic charm. I was excited to start fresh in this new home, away from the noise of the city. It didn't take long before I started noticing some odd things about the house. At first, they were small details: creaky floorboards, lights that flickered, and windows that wouldn't quite shut. Nothing major. But then I discovered the door. I'd been living in the house for a few months before I realized there was an odd, unused hallway behind the kitchen. One evening, I was doing some cleaning when I noticed a door at the end of the hallway, hidden in plain sight. It was small, wooden, and old, but more importantly, it was locked. I'd explored the entire house by then, and I was sure there was no room behind that door. So, I thought it was strange that it was there. What was behind it? I had no idea, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a screwdriver and managed to remove the lock, the metal rusted and brittle with age. As soon as I pulled the door open, I was hit with a strange smell. Stale air mixed with something metallic. The room inside was pitch black. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I flipped it on, nothing happened. I stepped inside, my flashlight in hand, and started to shine it around. The room was empty, except for a single object in the center, a large antique wooden chair positioned directly in the middle of the room. It was old, and the wood was dark, almost black. But what stood out most was the fact that the chair had straps on the arms and legs. As I looked closer, my stomach turned. The chair was worn in places where the fabric had frayed and torn, as if it had been used over and over again. But the most unsettling part was the way the chair seemed to stare at me. Suddenly, a feeling of dread washed over me, as though the room itself was alive, watching me. The walls were covered in what looked like old, faded scratches. They weren't deep enough to be called carvings, but they were undeniably marks, lines, like someone had scraped something over and over. I took a few steps forward, compelled by an overwhelming sense of curiosity, but as soon as I stepped closer to the chair, a loud noise echoed from behind me. It was the sound of something heavy shifting on the floor. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was in the room with me. The temperature dropped, and I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine. I backed up toward the door, feeling the walls close in around me. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, soft but distinct. "Don't leave me here." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was coming from the chair. I stared at it, feeling my pulse race. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I struggled with the handle, my hands shaking, and finally managed to get the door open. I ran out of that room and didn't stop until I was outside. I didn't return to the house for days. When I did, everything seemed normal again, but I couldn't forget what I'd seen. The room was still there, locked, and I never opened it again. I later learned that the house had a history I hadn't been told about. A previous owner, an elderly man, had been a recluse who lived alone for many years. He had a reputation for being eccentric, and some people believed he had been involved in dark practices. The house was rumored to have been a place for, well, let's just say, things that shouldn't have been done. I don't know what was in that room, but I do know that it wasn't just the chair. Something was waiting.